This trip through your wires will involve my dad's old tape deck. It's an AKAI CS-34D, manufactured from 1976 to 1978. Viewers have complained bitterly about my pronunciation of Japanese as to the name of the company that produced this machine and the one I discussed in the last video. My dad always said AKAI, but then my dad says Hyundai too. So I suppose in English you could equally say AKAI. Okay, this deck was marketed as a two-head single compact cassette deck. Compact? It weighs over 10 pounds. Maybe they were talking about the cassette tape itself. This machine takes standard cassette tapes. With a cassette, instead of a reel, there is no need to thread the tape through the capstans and pulleys like you needed to do with the reel-to-reel decks that preceded it. You just put the tape straight in, and the whole thing is so much easier and smaller. It plays and records left and right channels on the one side of the tape, until you flip it over to use the two tracks on the other side of the tape. One head is both playback and record, while the other is the erase head, which always erases what was on the tape beforehand, if you record anything new to it. It has Dolby and a built-in limiter to help tame sudden out-of-control changes in volume and frequency. The internet tells me that it contains 32 transistors and 18 diodes. Neat. My dad tells me that the reason he got this deck to begin with was to help out an old guy from our church group over in Montreal. Mr. Price recorded guest speakers at church onto reel-to-reel, and my dad would get reels in the mail and convert them to cassette format so they could be ordered by mail and listened to on cassette players. So, to begin with, my dad would continually be leaving these machines running like this, always listening from the next room to hear the tape pop when the cassette had come to the end of the one side, so he could come in and flip the tape over, rewind the reel-to-reel a bit, and begin recording the rest of the sermon on the other side. Cassette tapes most commonly came with room for 30 or 45 minutes a side, so not quite long enough to get an entire hour-long talk recorded without flipping the tape midway through. Even while recording the guest speaker to begin with. You could buy tape with 60 minutes on a side, but these were less readily available and generally of inferior quality despite being more expensive. And sometimes, sermons went slightly over the hour mark anyway, at least they did at my church. My father also sometimes used his tape deck to capture programs or music from the radio to cassette tape, and also his old LP records. Cassettes were in use from before I was born, right until I was in my 30s. To begin with, we all made tapes by recording LP records and also songs from the radio to them, pressing pause to skip any commercials or DJ patter, of course, and by the end of their life, we were still making mixtapes for our cars, based on music from CDs and even MP3s from the internet. I even knew a guy who'd hook a VCR tape up to a cassette deck and make car mixtapes to listen to movies he liked, or live concert videos recorded on VHS tapes.
Now, the making of a good compilation tape is a very subtle art, many do's and don'ts. First of all, you're using someone else's poetry to express how you feel. This is a delicate thing.
This was the golden age of the mixtape. If you liked a girl, you could make her a cassette tape with all of your favorite songs on it to show her how deep and sensitive you were and tell her how you felt.
The making of a great compilation tape, like breaking up, is hard to do and takes ages longer than it might seem. You got to kick it off with a killer to grab attention. Then you got to take it up a notch. But you don't want to blow your wad, so then you got to cool it off a notch. There are a lot of rules.
But back to the 70s. The next thing my father did was buy a second AKAI deck, so he could copy cassette tapes to other cassette tapes. As you can see, this new model of deck leaves behind the 70s aesthetic of being decorated with fake wood to match your living room paneling and furniture, and embraces the Darth Vader's bachelor pad style that replaced it. As kids, there were story and music records for children in everyone's houses, but record players are harder for children to use than tape decks, so parents often dumped the records to tape.
He came down from the tree to look at the large yellow hat. The hat had been on the man's head. George thought it would be nice to have it on his own head.
Hi, Casey. Have you seen my other box of nails?
They're right there, Mr. Dressup. What are you going to use them for?
Well, Casey, I'm building a surprise.
Oh, but you can tell me what it is.
No, not yet, Casey. You'll just have to keep on guessing.
I've waited long enough, and now the time has come.
Oscar, what are you doing anyway?
What does it look like I'm doing, Bob?
Well, it looks like you're, making a mess.
I'm getting ready to sing my song, so I'm throwing out all my trash onto the sidewalk. Isn't it beautiful?
Well, I wouldn't say it's exactly beautiful, Oscar.
Well, I would. Just look at it all.
I listened to tapes of Mr. Dressup and Sesame Street and Curious George. And my cousins had a Smurfs record I copied to tape too. But my father objected to the Smurfs.
Oh, when the Smurfs go marching in. Oh, when the Smurfs, oh, they go marching in. Yes, I wanna be in that number. Oh, yeah, when Smurfs go marching in.
Singing a disrespectful parody of a Christian hymn. And singing about beer, even though it was Smurfing beer. And with Smurfing beer, you won't get drunk, and it isn't dear. What a Smurfing disgrace. This was a time when shows like, say, Star Trek or The $6 Million Man had long been cancelled and were often not even being repeated on any TV stations available where we lived. But you could go to the library and get records of TV shows and Disney movies no longer being seen at theaters or on TV.
This is the story of Peter Pan. You can read along with me in your book. You will know it is time to turn the page when you hear the chimes ring like this. Let's begin now. All this has happened before, and it will all happen again. But this time it happened to Wendy, John, and Michael Darling.
Oscar Goldman just called. Said you should see him in his office right away. Emergency.
It's always an emergency. Well, guess I'll see.
Colonel Austin?
Yeah? What is it, white guy?
You stepped out of that centrifuge while it was still spinning. Nobody's ever done that before, Colonel. What?
Health food.
Or of superheroes who had certainly never been in a movie yet.
But a few minutes earlier, in another part of the city, Peter Parker, boy student, who is otherwise known as Spider-Man, is passing a newsstand. One glimpse of the Daily Bugle and...
That does it. This time Jameson's gone too far.
And you could listen to the stories, often with a colorful book that went along with them, usually with different actors than the original.
Yeoman, give me a hand with this, will you please?
Yes, sir.
I confess, Captain, that for a change I find myself empathizing with Dr. McCoy. This is a considerable disappointment.
For me too, Spock. Captain's log, stardate 5440.
And you could dump these records down to cassette tape before returning them to the library. There was no copy protection in place at all. This was a time when no one was going to be able to make a live-action Hollywood version of The Lord of the Rings, but you could sign out an audiobook on record of it from the library and dump that to cassette tape at home. Cassette tapes were sold by the pack and were very inexpensive. You could put whatever you wanted on them, even your own voice, if you had a microphone. And I did have access to microphones. You see, my father not only converted and copied tapes he'd get in the mail from old Mr. Price in Montreal, he was also the local guy in charge of recording visiting church guest speakers. I don't have his microphones anymore, but I have his 2 tape decks still, and I even have one of his 4 mic stands used for recording Bible discussion meetings with a group of men, all needing to be recorded, but not sitting together at the front close to a single microphone. You can see that my dad put 4 stripes of car pinstriping to mark this as mic stand 4, just as he put 3 stripes on mic stand 3, and so on. Remember when a flashy car just had to have a pinstripe down the side? It was a big kick when, being required to attend the quite literally thousands of hours of church I had instead of a childhood, I got to help create the recordings of the visiting speakers from a young age. These were men whose sermon tapes, labeled in my father's writing, might end up anywhere in the world. And these guys came through on tour from anywhere in the world. That's how our church worked. This guy was visiting from South America, and we recorded him. So rather than slumping in the back of the church like many of the other kids trying not to nod off in an age before cell phones, I would help set up the mics and stands and cabling, toss a mat over the cables to ensure no one would trip over them, maybe use some electric tape to further secure things, and then set the levels on the tape deck. I'd press down the pause button, then fork my fingers to push down play and record together to ensure the deck was ready to go and picking up sound. Sometimes my father would go speak into the mic he'd placed on the podium, purely to record the sermons, which weren't necessarily amplified as these men could hit the back of the room with their lungs alone, and I would slide the faders until Dad's voice was going to be picked up with a strong enough signal,
but not loud enough to distort the recording all to crap.
I was too little to reach the microphone myself back then, so I ran the faders. These decks were more than capable of recording music in stereo, but apart from the speaker's microphone picking up the a cappella singing of the opening and closing hymns at church gatherings where musical instruments were seen as sensual and fleshly and worldly beside, we never really set up mics and recorded music with them, my dad and I. To reflect the kind of inoffensive, worldly pop music that my parents wouldn't really object to me copying to cassette from the radio, records, or even 8-track tapes back in the day, I will move on from the previous video's John Denver to my own personal gateway drug to rock and roll, the boundary-pushingly heavy and intense Neil Diamond. As before, one mic input gets mainly guitar, the other mainly voice.
Where it began, I can't begin to know it, but then I know it's growing strong. Was in the spring, and spring became the summer. Who'd have believed you'd come along? Hands, touching hands, reaching out, touching me, touching you. Never seems so good. I'd be inclined to believe they never would, but now
Of course, if I was really pleased with my tape recording and had tons of money, I could send off my tape to get it professionally mastered, with more sensible panning for a good stereo image but still sensible sounding in mono machines, some EQing to brighten up and unmuffle the overall sound of the song, and maybe some compression to fatten the sound and a bit of reverb to create a false sense of a good sounding room the song sounds like it's being performed in. I could also have the producer hire a session trumpet player and a choir and pay them by the hour to add what's missing from the recording into it after the fact in a different time and place. Well, nowadays I can do all of that to some degree, using my laptop.
look at the night, and it don't seem so lonely. We fill it up with only two. And when I hurting runs off my shoulders. How can I hurt when holding you? Warm, touching warm, reaching out, touching me, touching you. Sweet Caroline, good times never seem so good. I'd be inclined to believe they never would. Sweet Caroline, good times never seem so good. Sweet Caroline.
This deck has one tape head doing double duty as both playback and record, so there was no real way to make it add an echo to the recordings we did, unlike the reel-to-reel player from the last video.
If you recorded yourself inside a bathroom,
or through a cardboard tube held between your mouth and the microphone, or inside a wooden box or something, you could get a fairly different sound. My cousins and I did all manner of silly, childish skits and weirdness, though.
I want to do my impression of Curry, Scott.
Burpees.
Play bagpipes?
Oh, Mickey can play a bagpipe too. Oh no, the bagpipe. Oh, I have to adjust this. Oh, that's better. That's too low. I have to turn it up. Oh, that's too high. I have to put it back then.
Is called headache, fever.
I lived to see heavy, big, expensive professional cassette playing and recording gear like this deck get replaced by dirt cheap, handheld, department store sold battery-powered units with built-in tiny microphones and speakers, and which might even hold 2 cassettes and copy tape to tape at double speed for you. You could pick up and record radio easily with these units. The radio sound was recorded directly to the tape without needing a microphone or picking up any room noise. About when I was entering high school, I got a cheap portable tape recorder, which we called a ghetto blaster because we were street like that. It had an odd quirk. You can hold the play button down not quite all the way, and the tape would slip through much more quickly than it was supposed to, giving us silly chipmunk voices.
You can hear me better than I can hear myself. You know why? Because you're recording.
These Pro decks, though, had higher quality parts and more controls, inputs, and outputs than the cheap ones, so I still used them for recording until I was almost 20. My father fell afoul of the cliquish political infighting and nastiness that all too often tends to characterize church groups, and by my mid-teens, his services in any capacity whatsoever were no longer required there. All of his gear sat in closets gathering dust from then on, unless I dragged it out when I was bored. As for me, I certainly hadn't learned how to play the guitar at that point, nor was there one in the house, but I was in brass band in high school playing trumpet. I was allowed to attend band practice because it wasn't on a church night, and so long as I didn't go on any band trips. So there was not even a single
Oh, and this one time at band camp?
for me. Being raised without movies and television in our home, one of the perhaps a bit odd things I did was go to other people's houses with recording gear like this deck before I had anything portable, stick the microphone in front of the single little speaker on their mono television, have them shut up and not giggle and hope the pets and telephone were silent, and add to my collection of tape-recorded TV theme songs. Radio wasn't ruled out like TV in our home, but The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and The Dr. Demento Show aired in the evening while I was at church. Life, don't talk to me about life. So I'd stick a mic up to the radio speaker, set the deck to record with an hour-long tape in it, put the whole thing on a house timer so radio and deck would click on about when we were singing the opening hymn in town at church, and I could come home afterward, rewind the tape, and listen to the whole thing. It was like magic.
Wind up your radio. Westwood One presents the Dr. Demento Show.
Dead puppies, dead, 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 dead puppies. Dead puppies aren't much fun.
Come on, everybody. It's a gritty, scum-sucking, pencil-neck geek.
He said that. Out of sight, let's hear it right now.
Heads, fish, heads, roly-poly fish, heads, fish, heads, fish, heads, eat them up, yum.
Star trekking across the universe.
On the Starship Enterprise under Captain Kirk.
Star trekking across the universe.
Polygon
This is what he hollered at me as I walked in his shop. Oh, get out of here with that before I call a cop. Oh.
Boot to the head.
I asked him his name and in a raspy voice he said Yoda. Y-O-D-A, Yoda. Yo-yo-yo-yo-Yoda.
I put a pillow over the microphone and speaker, of course, so my parents wouldn't know I was recording on a Sunday by any sounds coming out of my bedroom where everything was set up.
The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Starring Peter Jones as the book, with Simon Jones and Jeffrey McGillen.
Hoopy-frood that I was, I kept the crappy-sounding Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy tapes until I bought the whole thing on CD when I went to England a decade later. Many of the 80s TV theme songs in my tape-recorded collection were fun to play on trumpet, and I wanted to record myself playing them on trumpet too. In band, I'd started playing third, then second trumpet doing the harmony parts, but I was soon a first trumpet playing the melodies on a number of triumphant fanfare TV and movie theme songs. What I really wanted to do was record myself at home in private playing all three trumpet parts and some other instruments beside to a given theme song, but the best gear I had access to would record once, then erase all that when you went to record the next thing. So I got an idea. Now, I didn't invent ping-ponging, but in my teens I thought of it by myself and tried it out. What I realized was, you can record left and right tracks to a tape, right? And you can copy that tape to another machine using the inputs? Well, what if you recorded yourself playing the first part, then copied that to the second machine, but with a microphone hooked up to the second machine at the same time to record a second part to go with the first? You'd have a tape with yourself playing two different trumpet parts despite having only the one mouth. Fun! But then I noted that my father had an adapter cable for splitting, say, a single recorded track of sermon from a single microphone to both left and right of the inputs to your second machine. This way neither ear would have only silence, well, tape hiss, in it. Well, I reasoned, you could also use the splitter backwards and combine left and right tracks coming out of your first deck, stick that into a single deck on your second machine, add the microphone to the other input, and add a third track. Then you could do the whole thing again and add a fourth and a fifth and so on. This concept was utterly amazing to me. In fact, the only reason I didn't do this all the time was because I found when I did it, each time I copied to a new tape, the pre-recorded sound from the original tape got weaker and more muffled on the new tape, and the noise level and tape hiss increased exponentially, Dolby or no Dolby. And all of the parts were kind of mashed together, so you couldn't turn up things that were getting drowned out, nor turn down parts that were too loud or do anything with the left and right of any of it. As you copied copies of copies, the decks would very quickly shift the pitch of the pre-recorded music up and or down until it was impossible to play in tune with it. Let me demonstrate what I mean. Still pretty cool. Once again, With my laptop, I can record as many distinct separate music parts as I like, adding an army of trumpets and voices and things, and I can add separate effects to each and every single recorded part, turning it up and down and panning it from left to right, editing bits out of it, copying and pasting bits into it, and generally tinkering all day until I get tired of messing with the whole thing. By the time I left high school and was trying to learn to play guitar to do Neil Young rather than Neil Diamond songs, I knew I needed to get me one of those specially made cassette recorders that used front and back side of the tape all at once to record 4 tracks instead of just 2, and which didn't erase previously recorded material on the other tracks when recording a new one. Next time, the Yamaha MT-120 4-track cassette recorder. I don't seem to have much of a problem pronouncing Yamaha.